Section 47 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 30. The portion of the Vatican Palace set apart for the election of the Pope and called the Conclave consisted of 5 halls or large marble rooms, 2 chapels and a gallery 70 feet long. Each of these halls was divided temporarily into small apartments running up both sides with a broad alley between them, formed of wood and covered with green or violet cloth. One of these apartments was assigned to each cardinal with his attendants. The entrance to the whole of these rooms, halls, chapels, and gallery was by a single door fastened by 4 locks and as many keys. As soon as the cardinals had entered the conclave, this door was made fast, and the 4 keys were given to the 4 different orders of the city, 1 to the Bishop of Rome, 1 to the cardinals themselves, a 3rd to the Roman nobility, and the 4th to the officer, a great noble who kept the door. A wicket in the door, of which this officer also kept the key, permitted the daily meals and other necessaries to be handed to the cardinal's servants, every dish being carefully examined before it was allowed to pass in. Within the conclave, light and air were only obtained by skylights or windows opening upon interior courts, precluding communication from without. The gloom of the interior was so great that candles were burnt throughout the conclave at noonday. From the moment the conclave was closed, a silence of expectation and anxiety fell upon all Rome. The daily life of the city was hushed. The principal thoroughfares and fortresses were kept by strong detachments of armed troops, and the approaches to the mysterious door were jealously watched. Men spoke everywhere in whispers, and nothing but vague rumours of the proceedings within were listened to in the places of public resort, and in the coteries and gatherings of all ranks and conditions of the people. In the interior of the conclave, for those who were confined within its singular seclusion, the day passed with a wearisome monotony marked only by intrigue not less wearisome. Early in the morning a tolled bell called the whole of its inmates to mass in one of the small chapels, darkened with stained glass, and lighted dimly by the tapers of the altar, and by a few wax candles fixed in brass sockets suspended from the roof. The cardinals sat in stalls down either side of the chapel, and at the lower end was a bar kept by the master of the ceremonies and his assistants, behind which the attendants and servants were allowed to stand. Mass being over, a table was placed in front of the altar, upon which were a chalice and a silver bell. Upon 6 stools near the table are seated 2 cardinal bishops, 2 cardinal priests, and 2 cardinal deacons. Every cardinal, in his turn, upon the ringing of the bell, leaves his seat, and having knelt before the altar in silent prayer for the guidance of heaven in his choice, goes round to the front of the table and drops a paper, upon which he has written the name of a cardinal, into the chalice, and returns in silence to his stall. A solemn and awful stillness pervades the scene, broken only by the tinkling of the silver bell. The cardinals, one by one, some of them stalwart and haughty men, with a firm step and imperious glance, others old and decrepit, scarcely able to totter from their places to the altar, or to rise from their knees without help, advanced to their mysterious choice. To the eye alone it was in truth a solemn and impressive scene, and by a heart instructed by the sense of sight only, the awful presence of God the Paraclete might, in accordance with the popular belief, be felt to hover above the sacred host, but in the entire assembly to whom alone the sight was given, there was probably not one single heart to which such an idea was present. The assembly was divided into different parties, each day by day intriguing and manoeuvring, by every art of policy and every inducement of worldly interest, to add to the number of its adherents. If perchance, says one well qualified to speak, there entered into this conclave any old cardinal, worn by conflict with the Church's enemies, in partibus infidelium, amid constant danger of prison or of death, or perchance coming from amongst harmless peasants in country places, and by long absence from the centre of the Church's polity, ignorant of the manner in which her princes trod the footsteps of the apostles of old, and by the memory of such conflict and of such innocence, and because of such ignorance, was led to entertain dreams of divine guidance. 2 or 3 days' experience caused such an one to renounce all such delusion, and to return to his distant battlefield, and so to see Rome no more. When every cardinal has deposited his paper, the cardinal bishop takes them out of the chalice one by one, and hands them to the cardinal deacon, who reads out the name of the elected, but not of the cardinal who had placed the paper in the chalice, which is written on part of the paper, so folded that even the reader does not see it. And as he reads the name, every cardinal makes a mark upon the scroll of names he has before him. When all the names have been read, the cardinal priest, from a paper which he has prepared, reads the name of him who has had the most voices and the number of the votes. If the number be more than 2/3 of the whole, the cardinal who has received the votes is thereby elected pope. But if not, the cardinal priest rings the silver bell once more, and at the signal the master of the ceremonies, Monsignor Fabe, advances up the chapel, followed by a groom carrying a brazier of lighted coals, into which, in the face of the whole assembly, the papers are dropped one by one till all are consumed. At the beginning of the conclave, the cardinals were always divided into 2, if not more, parties of such relative strength as to make the attainment of such a majority by either of them impossible for many days. It was not until the persistent intrigues of a fortnight had increased the majority of any one cardinal, so much as to give a probability of his being ultimately elected, that the waverers of all sides, not willing to be known as the opponents of a new pope, recorded their voices in his favour, and thus raised the majority to its necessary proportion. For this very delicate matter occurred at this period of the election, that, should the requisite majority of voices be obtained, the master of the ceremonies and his brazier were no longer called for, but the whole of the papers were opened to their full extent, and the names of the voters given to the world, whereby, as one conversant in these matters observes, many mysteries and infidelities are brought to light. It is evident, therefore, that as the majority of any one cardinal increased or showed signs of increasing, morning and evening, as the suffrages were taken, the voting became a very exciting and delicate matter. No one could be certain but that at the next voting the majority from the cause mentioned would suddenly swell to the necessary size, and every man's name be made clear and plain on whose side he had been. Upon entering the conclave, the friends of Cardinal Chigi adopted a quiet policy, and waited for the progress of events to work for them. The abuses of the late pontificate and the excitement and indignation of popular opinion had made it clear to all parties that it was necessary to elect a pope whose character and reputation would restore confidence. In these respects, no one seemed more qualified than Cardinal Chigi, who was supposed to possess all the qualifications necessary to ensure the Romans from the apprehension of a revival of the past disorders, and to inspire the whole Christian world with the hopes of witnessing a worthy successor of St. Peter, displaying the Christian virtues from the papal chair. The great reputation he had gained at Munster, the determination he was said to have manifested to reform all abuses, the authority and influence he derived from his post of Secretary of State, his attractive and gracious manner, the recommendation of the late Pope upon his deathbed, all tended to bring his name prominently forward. He was supported by the Spanish cardinals, chiefly on account of the enmity of the French court and of his professed opposition to Cardinal Mazarin. But, in spite of these advantages, the enmity of the French court and the opposition of the Barberini family, the relations and supporters of the late Pope, made it necessary for his friends to observe extreme caution. The French cardinals were ordered to vote for Sacchetti, and Cardinal Barberini for the present supported him also, with all his party, chiefly because he had not yet made terms with the Spanish court, which opposed Sacchetti, but also, as was supposed, because he himself had aspirations towards the papal chair, should he find the electors favourable to such a scheme. Upon the entrance into the conclave, therefore, Cardinal Sacchetti immediately obtained 32 or 33 votes. These were not quite so many as the Barberini expected, and indeed had a right to count upon after the professions which the cardinals of the party had made. This was owing to the defection of some members of what was called the Flying Squadron, composed chiefly of young cardinals who were supposed to be devoted to the Barberini, but of whom several were secretly favourable to Cardinal Chigi. The Spanish faction, which was numerous enough to have secured the election of any cardinal had it been united, but the members of which were agreed upon nothing but their determined opposition to Sacchetti, contented itself with voting negatively at every scrutiny, making use of the form excedo nemini. This course was pursued for 2 entire months, during which time the scrutinies were taken regularly morning and evening, always with a slightly varying but indecisive result. It would be difficult to realize the wearisomeness which reigned in the conclave during so protracted a period. The crowding together of so large a number of persons in a few apartments, the closeness of the air, and the unbroken monotony of the hours that passed so slowly, made the confinement almost intolerable. One cardinal was taken ill and was obliged to be removed. The great gallery was generally used by the cardinals themselves for exercise and conversation, while their attendants were compelled to content themselves with their master's apartments or the corridors and passages. Those which opened on the interior courts and thereby afforded some fresh air were especially resorted to. Communication from without, though in theory absolutely prevented, was really frequent, all the chief among the cardinals receiving advices from foreign courts and conveying intelligence thither themselves. At intervals, the whole of the inmates were assembled to listen to Father Quakers, preacher to the conclave, a Jesuit, and secretly in favour of Cardinal Chigi, as was the society in general. The sermon was so contrived as to influence its hearers considerably by its evident application to the manners and conduct of the cardinal. The famous de Retz, then an exile from France and a supporter of Chigi, by whom he always sat in the chapel, was the principal intriguer in his favour. He was in communication with the nominal supporters of Barberini, who sent him intelligence by Monseigneur Fabre, when to vote for Sacchetti on occasions when it would be of no real service to him, and when to refrain. On one of these latter occasions Fabre entrusted his message to Inglesant, with whom he was intimate, and it afterwards appeared that Sacchetti, on that scrutiny, wanted but very few votes to have secured his election. This circumstance made a deep impression on de Retz, and he never recognized Inglesant afterwards without alluding to it. The day after this scrutiny, Cardinal Barberini appears to have thought that the time was come for his friends to make a demonstration in his behalf, and to the astonishment of the conclave, 31 votes appeared in his favour in the next scrutiny. This caused the friends of Cardinal Chigi to pay more attention to his conduct, and to the discourses of his conclavists and other partisans, who neglected no opportunity of exalting his good qualities. The exhaustion of the conclave became extreme. Cardinal Carafa, who, next to Sacchetti and Chigi, stood the greatest chance of election, became ill and died. 12 other cardinals were balloted for, one after another, without result. Cardinal San Clemente was then brought forward, and, but for the hostility of the Jesuits, might have been elected, but the Spanish cardinals who supported him did not dare openly to offend the society, and the election failed. The Barberini began to despair of electing their candidate, and having received favourable advices from the court of Spain, were willing, either with or without the concurrence of their leader, to negotiate with the friends of Cardinal Chigi. Sacchetti, finding his own chances hopeless, was not averse to be treated with. There remained only the court of France. Be this as it may, Cardinal Sacchetti's letter had the desired effect upon Mazarin, who immediately sent the necessary letters to the French cardinals, withdrawing the veto upon Chigi. Nothing remained now but to gain the concurrence of Cardinal Barberini. For a long time he refused to accede, but the members of his party, who had from the first secretly supported Chigi, having now openly declared in his favour, Barberini at last consented to hold a conference. It took place immediately after the morning scrutiny, and lasted but a short time. But it sat long enough to arrange that the next morning Cardinal Chigi should be elected Pope. This determination was so suddenly arrived at, and was concealed so carefully, that nothing certainly was known during the rest of the day, outside the number of those who had taken part in the conference. There were vague rumours and many discontents, but the time was so short that many who would have declared in favour of Sacchetti, had longer time been given them, were not able to recover from their surprise. Inglesant was of course informed by Cardinal Chigi of what had occurred immediately after the conference, and about midday he received a message from de Retz warning him to be upon his guard. During the afternoon, however, some further intelligence of the feeling within the conclave came to the knowledge of that astute intriguer, and he sent Monsignor Fabe to Inglesant about 5 o'clock. This man was a favourable specimen of the Italian servant of an ecclesiastical court. Belonging to a family which had been trained for generations in the service of the courtier, he was a man to whom the difficulties which perplexed others, and the anomalies which appeared to some men to exist between Christian polity as it might be conceived to be, and Christian polity as it was practised in Rome, did not exist. A man to whom the divine, so far as it was manifested to him at all, took the form, without doubt or scruple, of that gorgeous, though unwieldy, and, as it seemed to some, slightly questionable economy of which he was the faithful servant. He was honest, yet he appeared, such was the peculiarity of his training and circumstances, to have solved the, on good authority, insoluble problem of serving two masters at the same time. For two opposing cardinals, or two factions of cardinals, alike commanded his reverence and service at the same moment. Much of this service was no doubt unthinking and unconscious, else the memoirs of such a man, composed by himself without reserve, would be perhaps as interesting a book as could be written. "Something is going on within the conclave, cavaliere," he said, "of which I am not entirely cognizant. Of course, I am aware of the communications which have been made from outside during this most protracted conclave. The princes of the Church must have every opportunity given them of arriving at a just conclusion in this most important matter, and I have never been backward in affording every assistance to their eminences. But what we have to deal with tonight is of a very different kind. You have nothing to dread from the chiefs of the opposite party. They have accepted the situation, and will loyally carry out their engagements. But they have altered their policy without consulting or remembering their supporters, and among these, especially the inferior ones outside the conclave, the disappointment is severe. They have not time, nor are they in a position to make terms with a successful party, and their expectations of advancement are annihilated. They are, many of them, absolutely unscrupulous, and would hazard everything to gain time. They have some means of communication between the outside world of Rome and their partisans within the conclave, which they have not used till now, and with which, therefore, I am unacquainted. They are employing it now. What the exact effort will be I do not know, but should your padrone, Cardinal Chigi, fall ill before tomorrow's scrutiny, it would delay his election, and delay is all they want. There are sufficient malcontents to prevent his election if they had only time. 2 or 3 days would give them all they want. I should advise you not to sleep tonight, but to watch with a wakefulness which starts at every sound." The apartment assigned to Cardinal Chigi was subdivided into 3 smaller ones, the largest of which was appropriated to the bedchamber of the cardinal, the 2 others to his attendants. These apartments communicated with each other, and only one opened upon the centre corridor running down the hall. The cardinal retired early to his own chamber, and most of the other cardinals did the same. A profound silence reigned in the conclave. If any of the attendants still stirred, they were velvet-shod, and the floors and walls, lined with velvet, prevented the least sound from being heard. Inglesant remained alone in the outermost of the 3 apartments, and determined to keep his faculties on the alert. For some reason, however, either the fatigue of the long confinement or the death-like stillness of the night, a profound drowsiness overpowered him, and he continually sank into a doze. He tried to read, but the page floated before his eyes, and it was only by continually rising and pacing the small chamber that he kept himself from sinking into a deep sleep. A profound peace and repose seemed to reign in a place where so many scheming and excited brains, versed in every art of policy, were really at work. Inglesant had sat down again and had fallen once more into a slight doze, when suddenly, from no apparent cause, his drowsiness left him, and he became intensely and almost painfully awake. The silence around him was the same as before, but a violent agitation and excitement disturbed his mind, and an overpowering apprehension of some approaching existence, inimical to himself, aroused his faculties to an acute perception and braced his nerves to a supreme effort. In another moment, this apprehension, at first merely mental, became perceptible to the sense, and he could hear a sound. It was, as it were, the echo of a low, faint, creeping movement, the very ghost of a sound. Whence it came Inglesant could not determine, but it was from without the apartment in which he sat. No longer able to remain passive, he rose, drew back the velvet curtain that screened the entrance from the corridor, opened the door silently, and went out. The corridor was lighted here and there along its great length by oil lamps suspended before every third door of the cardinal's rooms, but the dark and massive hangings, the loftiness of the hall overhead, and the dimness of the lamps themselves caused the light to be misty and uncertain, as in a confused and troubled dream. One of these lamps was suspended immediately above the door at which Inglesant had appeared, and he stood in its full light, being himself much more distinctly seen than he was himself able to see anything. He was richly dressed in dark velvet, after the French fashion, and in the uncertain light his resemblance to his murdered brother was, in this dress, very great. He held a slight and jewelled dagger in his hand. As he paused under the suspended lamp, the sound he had before heard developed itself into low, stealthy footsteps, approaching down the corridor, apparently on the opposite side, and the next moment a figure, more like a phantom thrown on the opposite wall than a substantial being, glided into sight. It was shrouded in dark and flowing drapery, and kept so close to the heavy hangings that it seemed almost the waving of their folds stirred by some unknown breeze. Though it passed down the opposite side, it kept its attention turned in Inglesant's direction, and almost at the same moment at which he appeared through the opening door, it saw him and instantly stopped. It lost its stealthy motion and assumed an attitude of intense and speechless terror, such as Inglesant had never seen depicted in a human being, and by this attitude revealed itself more completely to his gaze. The hood which shaded its face fell partly back, and displayed features pale as death, and lustrous eyes dilated with horror, and Inglesant could see that it held some nameless weapon in its hand. As it stood, arrested in its purpose, breathless and uncertain, it seemed to Inglesant a phantom murderer, or rather the phantom of murder itself, as though nothing short of the murderous principle sufficed any longer to dog his steps. This strange figure confronted Inglesant for some seconds, during which neither stirred, each with his eyes riveted upon the other, each with his weapon in his hand. Then the phantom murmured in an inarticulate and broken voice that faltered upon the air as though tremulous with horror. "It is himself! He has taken the dagger from his bleeding wound." Then, as it had come, it glided backwards along the heavy drapery, becoming more and more lost in its folds, till, at first apparently but the shadow of a shade, it faded more and more into the hanging darkness, and vanished out of sight. The next morning, at the scrutiny after early mass, Fabius Chigi, Cardinal and Secretary of State, was, by more than 2/3 of the whole conclave, elected Pope. End of section 47. Read by Belinda McReynolds, Melbourne, 4th October 2024.